Hello, family. Welcome back to Landline, your direct link to all things politics, comedy, and culture. I'm your host, Janaya Future Khan, champ yapper and frequent nuisance in the activist and comedy worlds. Let's get dialed in. So, are we in a recession? That's one. 2, Bangladesh banks. And 3, London burns. So, late last night or early this morning, I haven't slept yet. Does anybody else out there have problems sleeping? I have the worst. Anyway, it helps because I'm a news junkie anyway, so I just do that or watch Adventure Time or Steven Universe. Anyway, I couldn't help but note that Warren Buffett was out there selling stocks like crazy. Like he was just making so many moves. And that typically is a telltale sign that something is coming down the pipe. So, of course, I was furious because I hate knowing about what these billionaires are doing, but unfortunately, it has so much to do with the global economy. That's what happens when you're a billionaire, because that's just a weird concentration of wealth. So you might have seen in the news, there's all this talk about, what's going to happen in the stock market and, the Dow and blah, 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 blah. So I'll just say this. I was so annoyed because I knew I was going to have to talk about markets and economy and blah, 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 blah. But it is important. And here's what's key. I am not good at math because I'm attractive. But you don't have to be good at math to know what's going on in the global market and economy. Okay, so here's the pretext. To all my other hotties out there who are also a little bit dumb, nobody actually understands precisely how the market works. This is important to know because I've done my due diligence, I've done my little research, and that's actually it. There's just so many variables, it's not humanly possible, right? There's tens of thousands of parties and counterparties that make decisions based on dynamic and asymmetrical information flows. So as a result, all of these articles that are piling up on our timelines or on our news sites behind various paywalls, which I feel some kind of way about, but anyway, have a little bit of distrust with a lot of those articles that attempt to explain the causes of stock market fluctuations, and distrust those things the way that we distrust people with tea leaves or people who read bones or sticks. Actually, you know what? Some of them are really scary and very clandestine. You know what? Forget what I just said. They're very clairvoyant. Forget what I just said. I'm in a weird place where I'm not going to mess with any kind of mysticism. It could be the thing that changes everything for us. So I'll just say this. Don't trust those really fast, hardcore explainers. But I'm going to tell you why we're currently in this moment. So in the past 24 hours, Japanese stocks suffered a really intense collapse since 1987. And then other Asian markets cratered. And then tech stocks plummeted. And then the Dow plunged, and then several additional global markets suffered from various systems that were falling off, okay? So so the turmoil, which I would say is one of the, distinct economic forces, it's big enough basically to have a ricochet effect, right? And what does this all translate to? Because that's what I was like. I just read several articles and I have no idea what that means. It basically means, said differently, suddenly billions of dollars in value is erased. That's how wild this is and annoying this is. It's just gone. And because people are constantly gambling with our lives, it has various implications. So in this instance, the rapid rise of the yen, which is Japanese currency, over the past week disrupted the flow of global capital, prompting a pullback from many popular investments. Think, all the big names, all the big companies. So here's what we do know, right? So this particular historic global market correction is being driven by 3 major events. And I'm going to tell you that I'm getting my news sources primarily from The Atlantic and the New York Times because I'm not nuts and I'm not going to chance this on my own. I have no idea what I'm doing beyond reading Utopia for Realists and a series of other books by, Pitzker, etc. But anyway, so the recession fears is one of the things that stoke this. The AI bubble concerns. I looked this up because I wanted to be able to tell you exactly what this means. So the AI bubble concerns are whether investors and providers realistically understood how people were going to use the technology. So for example, and you might have heard me say different things about AI and how it can be useful or it can be really weird, but basically It takes so much energy and so much power to actually use for the AI technology to actually run. It takes an incredible amount of energy and an incredible amount of heat. So that alone is a factor that people didn't really take into consideration. But peep this, like think about Argentina right now, right? Argentina wants to use AI to predict future crimes against its citizens, right? And I'm like, Argentina, shouldn't you really be paying attention to past crimes? Okay. If we're talking about you, my friend. Anyway, whatever, that's just me. So the third thing is the unwinding of macro investor trades involving Japanese yen. So here's the main question. This is what got us started. Are we in a recession? I want to say, be not afraid, beloveds. The only consensus so far is that the economy has slowed down. So we know the American economy has slowed down, but we are not in a recession. And according to, again, the NY Times and the Atlantic, we're slowing down, but I started to look at what other people were saying. One of the people I looked into is Greg Dacko. He's a chief economist at some major accounting firm. EY said, and this seems like an overcorrection, an overreaction, especially given the limited economic data and Fed communication expected this week. This is what he wrote to his clients. Another person, Goolsbee, I really just wanted to say that name. What a phenomenal name. The president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago also suggested that the market sell-off was an overreaction to the most recent U.S. jobs report. I'm going to reference that in a moment. But he did acknowledge that slowdowns in labor data had been concerning. So what is the Federal Reserve saying right now? I promise you this is so boring, but I'm trying to make it so good. And then we're going to get into some really hot stuff. But anyway, so what is the Federal Reserve saying right now? There was expectation that they were going to cut interest rates the first time the inflation crisis began. So, you've heard the words inflation. I'm paying close attention to this because they're going to start blaming Kamala Harris for this very, very soon. They can't because she's not technically in power yet, but they're going to go to her for this. So, but the Federal Reserve thus far has declined to cut those interest rates. And I think that was a mistake because last week's jobs reports, they didn't factor those in. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that the official unemployment rate ticked up to 4.3%. This is concerning because in the past year, the jobless rate has increased by 0.8%. So historically, that tends to be a worrying indicator of a recession. But again, the only thing that we know is that our economy has slowed down, right? Japan currently is going to be the place that's hit hardest with this. So send some love and care to that very, very good-looking and technologically advanced country. It's going to be okay. So you're going to see a lot of words like recession thrown around. I brought this up so that we knew, do not take it too seriously. It just means that the economy is slowing down. We don't have enough information yet. So we know that. And why I'm saying this is, A, the stock market is coming off at an all-time high, and the U.S. economy continues to grow while inflation continues to decline. So these major meltdowns and these major crisis things, part of the reason we're even doing this show is because sometimes so much information is thrown at us, and I personally have no idea what to do with it, and it just feels good to not have to go through these things alone. Anyway, with that being said, we are not in a recession. We are flirting with a slowing economy, but we're going to be just fine. So with that, on to the next, Bangladesh bang. So look, I'm going to tell you something about Bangladesh. These hoes are fierce. They are ferocious, all right? They fought for their independence. This is a country with 170 million people. They fought for and won their independence and proclaimed it in 1971. So why have you been seeing Bangladesh in the news so much? What is going on? This is what happened. So the Prime Minister Hasina of Bangladesh resigned today after protests that began as peaceful demonstrations by students grew into a broader movement, calling for an end to increasingly authoritarian leadership of the nation. So this is what's really interesting. Up to this point, she's been pretty gangster. At least from a world perspective, Hasina has been someone who is, first of all, a woman in power in a region where that is very rare. She has a very compelling story of leadership. Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, right? She's among the world's longest serving female heads of government, so about 15 years. She's a secular Muslim, right, who wears these very beautiful, colorful saris, who fought against Islamist militancy. So think about what's happening all over the world with the rise of radicalized religions. This is a Muslim woman who was in a position of leadership, which is rare enough, I think, in certain contexts. And she was kind of awesome, lifted millions of people out of poverty. She definitely kept both India and China at her side. So what happened? Well, it goes the way that leadership goes too often, and it's very annoying, which is when somebody's success comes at a very high cost to, or I should say a leader's success comes at a very high cost to the people they govern. So the NY Times reported that over the past 15 years, Hasina has deeply entrenched her authority, and doing so divided the nation, right? So those who kissed the ring were rewarded with patronage, power, and impunity, which means if you messed with her, nobody was messing with you. You were the boss. You got to do what you wanted to do. But any dissenters were met with crackdowns, endless legal entanglement, and imprisonment. So student protesters who realized what was going on started to voice their concerns out in the streets very peacefully, and it came with a massive crackdown. Sound familiar? Sounds very American, doesn't it? Seems like students are really holding up the banner for freedom across the world, and it seems like our governments keep slapping them down. But anyway, after that initial first crackdown, the student protests revved up, and that was a deadly one for the record. So imagine the bravery and the courage it took to get back out on the streets. So the student protests revived, and they did this massive call for a new governing body, called the supporters. They took to the streets. They plunged the country into, what Hasina and her supporters would call a dangerous phase. So as of Sunday, so that's yesterday, really, when I recorded my last episode, almost 100 people were reported killed in clashes between security forces and protesters on Sunday across the country. So that is the most deadly interaction since, or at least up to this point. And the country's leaders imposed a new curfew, internet restrictions. They did anything to quell this growing anti-government movement. But again, it's not anti-government. This is the framing that bothers me. It's anti-authoritarian. And we're seeing anti-authoritarian movements against authoritarian governments that are taking over around the world. It fascinates me that here's a person that really held a more leftist approach than you would find in, I think, many other authoritarian governments, and yet still fell into this, well, I got to keep this power, I got to hold this power. And it's like, do your damn job, lady, do it well, and the people will support you. So clashes spread across the country. They could not be contained because students empower nations. It just, I think it caused a lot of fear around more political violence. Bangladesh has, like many places where revolution was required, there's a lot of instances of violent skirmishes and assassinations and coups and counter coups. Thank you, foreign policy, for helping to instill that. So she resigned. Hasina resigned as of today, and she fled the country. Her critics said that she tried to turn the country into a one-party state, right? So that's really what they were fighting against. And I got to tell you something. I watched a lot of the footage online I'll never call it X, on Twitter. And a lot of Bangladeshi folks they just ransacked her house. But one of my favorite things, because, these folks were just, brutalized, beaten, and killed by her government bodies simply for saying, you should not be trying to run an authoritarian state. So take some satisfaction in the fact that I saw a bunch of men wearing her beautiful, colorful saris. I know they're going to take them home to their moms and their daughters and their sisters and their wives. And they're going to be quite the gift. I even saw someone holding this huge fish. Nothing is going to waste is my point. It's just one of those unfortunate instances where a really wonderful vision and dream became corrupt by too much power for too long. And what it took for young people and their allies and lefties and radicals and everything else to take to the streets and risk life and limb to say, no, we're not doing this. We're not doing this way. And they won. I'm going to be watching very, very closely to find out what happens next. There is a bit of a vacuum. So the celebration often is met with really radical, not great attempts to seize power. So we're going to be watching that and following closely because, as we mentioned in a previous episode in Venezuela, there's now confirmation that old boy really did, in fact, steal the election and is pretending that millions and millions of people did not vote for Gonzalez. So on to the next. London burns. What the hell is going on in the UK right now? It's been all over my timeline, but it's not any massive major news story, but I'm seeing instance after instance after instance of people being arrested, of lefties and scholars and just regular people saying, you know, there's these far-right extremist mobs, like mobs of white men. And I got to tell you, if I see too many white men together with too much cargo on, I'm out of there. I am out. I'm off these streets. So imagine just everyday people across the board saying, no, something's really wrong. This is scary. So here's what happened. A peak of far-right violence fueled by anti-immigration hate, so anti-immigrant hate and racism. It just reached its peak in the UK over this weekend. I got to tell you, it's the worst I have seen in England. It's the worst I think that a lot of people have. Even cops are saying this should be treated as terrorism. When the cops, this is basically currently the UK's January 6th. You hear me? So in terms of scale, let me just break this down for you, right? They tried to so police have thus far made 378 arrests since the violence broke out last week. Rioters set fire to a library. Why? Because they heard that asylum seekers were staying there and that asylum seekers lived there. Do you understand? They did not care if there were people in that building or not. They didn't care that children, families, community use that space. This is literally an attack on knowledge, an attack on race, an attack against Muslims, an attack against immigrants. It is the exact kind of far-right violence that we have been talking about across the board that we're seeing instance of. And it's just interesting to me. I think we can start making the connections and start seeing that all the racism, right, and all the classism that we tried to bury, America, the West tried to bury, that built this country's wealth up, well, it turns out because it wasn't dealt with, and because we keep pointing the fingers at everybody else instead of looking up at the billionaires and corrupt superpowers that create our lived experience, all of these white men in particular, and white women are, especially post-Brexit, are buying into the idea that the reason why they are unhappy is because of Muslims and because of immigrants and because of black people. And if there's sports involved, because of trans people and specifically trans women. And it's like, you've done this before. You've been here. It didn't work. Do you think maybe you should try something else? The far-right mob tried to set fire to a Holiday Inn Express, right, in Rotherham on Sunday while people were still inside. I just need you to hear that. It's giving bombings in the South. This is disgusting. Right? Some masked rioters hurled pieces of wood, bottles, and chairs and sprayed fire extinguishers at police officers, 12 of whom were injured. Do you know? This shit is getting too ass backwards. These days, they got me out here sounding like a patriot. Now I got to sound like I care about what's going on to cops, the same way I had to care on January 6th. Like, this is a problem. And yet, police still, especially in America, but really across the board, try to minimize far-right violence that literally exists because they identify more with these mobs that are literally brutalizing them than somebody who looks like me. Even if I'm saying, yo, ACAB, but I don't need y'all dead on the street. I just need you to get rid of the uniforms. You know what I'm saying? So this is where we're at. Even the police officers were injured. 12 of them were. So they tried, people were inside, y'all. Inside. They were using racism to justify their actions. They didn't care if they killed people as long as some of them inside were Muslim and asylum seekers. That's what we're dealing with here. So anytime there's some weirdo progressive today or some centrist that's like, well, I think both sides are, and I think both sides are bad, or both sides are equally bad. One side, the left side, is saying, hey, we want bread on the table, we want equal opportunities, we want jobs, we want a better quality of life for everyone. Everyone should be able to get an education. Everyone should be able to access healthcare. And you have the other side that's saying, let's fucking kill and murder anybody that's a woman, anybody who is a different race, anybody that's a different religion. Let's just fucking eradicate them from existence. To even suggest that at this stage, I'm like, maybe you're part of how we got here. Maybe you should actually take a good, hard look at yourself in the mirror. Anyway, this is currently where we're at in London. So Australia, Nigeria, Malaysia, and Indonesia have issued travel alerts to their nationals living in or visiting the UK, right? They're saying, stay away. It's that bad. Amanda Pritchard, the chief executive of NHS England, warned that riots have become so scary for health services, multicultural workforce, they feel afraid and unwelcome. What are we doing to our nurses, doctors, PSWs, caregivers? We already just abused the shit out of them during COVID. Now they have to fear for their lives. The Royal College of Nursing called on ministers to ensure that anyone who targets nurses, quote, pays a very heavy price. So ministers have announced plans to introduce more than 500 new prison places over the next month to help cope with an influx of accused rioters expected to be held on remand. That's how many people are up in these streets rioting. White folks just losing their goddamn minds. The prime minister's spokesperson, right, criticized comments by Elon Musk after the ex-owner posted that, quote, civil war is inevitable in response to a video showing riots in Liverpool. I want you to be very clear that Elon Musk is very much invested in a kind of civil war. He's very much invested in an authoritarian government that suits the needs of building out his own wealth. I hope we see him fully for who he is now. I really do. MPs and 60 anti-racist and migrants' rights organizations called for Parliament to be recalled to address the violence and to, quote, ensure that all people in communities of color are protected. So why did this happen? Right? This originally happened because of a violent incident where 3 young people were stabbed to death. And what happened was the police did not immediately release the information on who murdered them. My understanding currently is that it was a man from Rwanda, which some of us mispronounce Rwanda, in just an insane, brutal, disgusting, random act of violence that was not associated with any political affiliation whatsoever. And in that moment, because of websites like X and because of people deeply invested in this narrative, like Tim Robinson, who really wants a kind of civil war to happen, they used that moment to say that it was Muslims who had done it. It was Muslims that had stabbed these girls to death. And at a vigil, this is the irony. This is how you know it's never about protecting girls, never about protecting women, never about protecting anyone. They attacked the people who were at the vigil for the young girls that had been murdered. That's what incited all of this violence to begin with. That's how disgusting this is. So it's the same violence we're seeing everywhere. It's unchecked racism and it's hatred, and it's using Muslims and immigrants and black people and people of color as scapegoats, right? I need us to see the connections. These are not things that I, enjoy reporting on. I do want to say the names of the women who were murdered in Southport. B.B. King, Elsie Stamcombe, and Elisa De Silva Aguiar, right? So may they rest in power, and may this mob, this racist, hate-filled, bigoted mob, meet the same failure and loss that they're hoping to put upon our asylum seekers and Muslims and immigrants who belong anywhere they want to be, because that's their right. That's our right as people. Anyway, so this was a tough one. but we got through it. It is so important that we pay attention to what is happening in places like London and the UK. They're so closely tied to what's happening here. We now have a little update on Bangladesh. And just to remind y'all, we are not in a recession. There's going to be a lot of econ scares coming up, but we're going to be okay. We're going to be just fine. Keep working on those dreams, and keep working on you. There is a future for us, I promise. So with that, let's hit up the voicemails and get that question of the day.
Hey, this is Miles in Los Angeles, and I'm looking for some advice on what you think it looks like to live out masculinity in a way that not only isn't toxic, but is actually healthy and makes the world a better place.
That is a great question, Miles. I'll say this. It's just doing you and being thoughtful and caring. Like, I think it's understanding first and foremost, understanding what your personal relationship to masculinity is. So for me, I like to embody certain very actually traditional gender roles. I like to be protective. I turn myself into a tiny little weapon, But does that protection mean that somebody is less free, or does that turn into possessiveness? So that's where that patriarchy and that misogyny comes in. So I think one is understanding your relationship to masculinity and communicating that, and having somebody communicate to you what their desires for that are. And then just in general practice, I just think being cool, like just be cool, communicate well, don't perform anger. These are things I thought I had to do. Look how much I talk. I don't shut. I want to talk about everything. I want to talk about my feelings. I want to talk about your feelings. I want to listen. I want to talk some more. I used to think that because I was the mask one, I had to be all stoic and walk out to the store. I didn't get nothing at the store except for some fruit Mentos and hurt feelings. So to me, it's understanding why it feels magical and majestic to you, and then just being normal about it and communicating as anybody would. But I do love that question, and I think that as people who identify as masc or as men, there has to be more work and a daily sort of check-in with oneself about how they're showing up. Are you taking up all this space? Are you giving as much as you're taking? Are you using that strength for good? If that's, part of how you identify. So those are some of the things that make it meaningful to me. And, I got a friend who's my BFF, and she's my ex, but she knows that if she calls me at 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m., I'll be at her house in 7 or 8 minutes flat. That's a lifelong commitment. And I think it's just ensuring, as a mass person, that relationships aren't transactional, that, it comes from a place that is genuine and sincere and loving. Because so often masked people are taught that anyone femme or feminine is a recreation for you. And that's the shittiest thing I could imagine. Why would you want to treat somebody as less when you could literally have a best friend? Get it together, So yeah, those are some things. And I think that's the same thing with any gendered relationship. There's the mask one sort of takes, the more mask presenting or mask identifying one ends up being like the logical one, or it's like, shut up, We don't gotta, it's just be you, figure out who you are, celebrate that shit. But honestly, I think masculinity should be a place of service more than anything else. I think that's where we're best suited. Anyway. That was a great question. I appreciate that. I'm just sending so much love out to y'all. What a full episode. Wow. And on to the next. That's it for the day, y'all. I just want to say thank you so much for listening to Landline. It means the world to me. This show really is a labor of love. Episodes are dropping on the daily. Find us on Spotify, Apple, and pretty much anywhere that podcasts are streaming. Please send us voice note questions to landlinewithjfk@gmail.com. I want to hear from you so bad. We're running low on questions. Oh my God. Shout out to KR and the Landline team. It's really just me and KR at this point anyway. And shout out to you, the listeners who make this all possible. Peace.